The silence in the tiny apartment was a physical weight, thick with the smell of dust and despair. Liam sat at the rickety kitchen table, the wood warped and stained from years of other people's lives. The only sound was the frantic, quiet hiss of his own breathing as he stared at the eviction notice. Its bold red letters a brutal slash across his world. He could feel the cold of the linoleum floor seeping through his thin socks, a chill that had nothing to do with the night and everything to do with the ice forming in his veins. In the other room, his daughter, Maya, slept, her small breaths a gentle, rhythmic counterpoint to the storm raging inside him. He felt his chest tighten, a knot of pure, unadulterated fear. Outside, under the jaundiced glow of a single streetlight, sat the ghost of his former life, a white delivery van, its engine silent, its tires flat, a metal corpse that had once been his ticket to providing, to surviving. He felt like a failure, a captain who'd run his ship aground with his most precious cargo still on board. The paper felt heavy, damning, in his calloused hands. He unlocked his phone, the cracked screen glowing with a number that felt more like a sentence than a balance. $78.14. He mouthed the words, the sound getting lost in the oppressive quiet. $78.14. That was the sum total of his world. It was rent money, food money, medicine money, all the things it wasn't enough to be. A wave of nausea rose in his throat, sharp and acidic. He pushed himself away from the table and walked to the refrigerator, pulling the door open with a reluctant groan of plastic. The weak interior light illuminated a landscape of scarcity. A quarter-full carton of milk, a single, slightly bruised apple, and a jar of mustard. That was it. His stomach twisted into a painful knot, a hollow ache that was part hunger and part pure terror. How could he look his daughter in the eye in the morning? How could he conjure a meal from this emptiness? He felt the cold air from the fridge on his face, a mocking reminder of the cold reality that was about to swallow them whole. He shut the door, plunging the kitchen back into shadow. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through the fog of his panic. The feel of his wife's hand in his, the hospital room smelling of antiseptic and finality. Her last whispered words, "Promise me, Liam. Promise you'll take care of our little girl." He had promised. He had sworn it. And now, the weight of that broken promise was crushing the air from his lungs. He felt a hot sting behind his eyes, but he blinked the tears away with a furious self-loathing. He didn't have the right to cry. Crying wouldn't fix the van. Crying wouldn't put food on the table or keep a roof over Maya's head. A cold sweat slicked his palms and the back of his neck as he imagined her small, trusting face asking why they had to leave, why she was hungry. The thought was a physical blow, making him stumble back against the counter. He was her hero, her protector, her father. But right now, he felt like a fraud, a man playing a role he was woefully unprepared for, with the stakes being the one person he loved more than life itself. The silence screamed his inadequacy. His gaze drifted to the window, to the hulking, shadowed form of the van. He could almost smell it from here, the faint, lingering scent of cardboard boxes, exhaust, and the cheap coffee he used to drink on the road. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was 1,000 early mornings, 1,000 tired but satisfied evenings. It was the rhythm of his life. He remembered the specific rattle of the side door, the way the radio would only work if you hit the dashboard just right, the worn spot on the driver's seat that was molded perfectly to him. He had spent more waking hours in that van than he had in this apartment. Now it just sat there, a monument to his powerlessness. The mechanic's words echoed in his head, short and brutal. Crankshafts shot, engines seized. It had cost more to fix it than it's worth. They might as well have been talking about him. He felt his own heart seize in his chest, a useless, broken piece of machinery. The van wasn't just broken. It was a tombstone marking the death of his ability to provide. "Daddy?" A tiny voice, thick with sleep, drifted from the bedroom. It wasn't a cry of distress, just a soft, questioning sound that shattered Liam's paralysis. It was Maya, his reason, his purpose. The sound cut through the suffocating blanket of his despair and struck him like a physical jolt. He moved silently to her doorway, his heart a painful, aching drum in his chest. In the faint light filtering from the street, he could see her small form curled up under a thin blanket, her dark hair splayed across the pillow. She was safe, for now. She was innocent. A surge of protective love, so fierce and primal it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. It was immediately followed by a tidal wave of pure, cold terror. He was all she had. He was the only thing standing between his beautiful, sleeping daughter and the cold, unforgiving world, and he was failing. He was out of time, out of money, and out of hope. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. What would you do if you were in his shoes? How would you find a way forward when every path seemed to lead to ruin? Desperate hours bled into the deepest part of the night, with Liam illuminated only by the cold, blue light of his cracked phone screen. He scrolled endlessly, his thumb a blur across the glass, searching job sites, classifieds, anything. The quiet question from Maya hours earlier, "Are we going on an adventure, Daddy?" had ignited a frantic, reckless energy in him. He had to turn this into an adventure, not an eviction. He had to find a miracle buried in the digital noise. With every swipe, the hope thinned, and the words on the eviction notice burned brighter in his mind's eye. He felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the feeling of drowning in slow motion. The apartment was a sinking ship, and he was frantically bailing water with a thimble, the vast, uncaring ocean of poverty rising all around them. He needed a lifeboat, a piece of driftwood, anything to cling to, and he needed it now, before the cold water closed over their heads for good. His eyes burned from staring at the screen, each pixel a tiny spark of his dwindling hope. Then he saw it. A listing so unappealing it was perfect. The photos were dark and blurry, the description sparse. Mechanic shop, as is sale, motivated seller. The price was a joke, a number so low it felt like a typo, a figure that barely exceeded the loan he knew he could beg from a friend. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot through him. He could almost smell the familiar scent of oil and metal, feel the satisfying weight of a wrench in his hand. His own van was a lost cause, but what if he could fix other people's cars? What if this wasn't an ending but a sideways beginning? The dream took root in the barren soil of his desperation, growing with wild, uncontrollable speed. A place of his own, a business, a way to fix not just cars, but his own broken life. He read the ad again and again, the words blurring as his heart hammered against his ribs. It was a long shot. It was reckless. It was the only shot he had. He felt the dangerous, intoxicating pull of a gamble he couldn't afford to lose. With trembling hands, he dialed his friend Mike. The shame was a bitter taste in his mouth, but the frantic hope was a roaring in his ears. He stumbled through the words, his voice cracking as he explained the plan, trying to make it sound like a sound investment instead of the last, desperate act of a drowning man. He could hear Mike's hesitation through the phone, the long silence that stretched for an eternity. "Liam, are you sure about this?" Sight unseen. The question hung in the air, heavy with common sense. But Liam was beyond common sense. He was running on pure, uncut desperation. Finally, with a sigh that carried the weight of their long friendship, Mike agreed. The money appeared in his account minutes later. Without letting himself think, Liam navigated to the seller's link and transferred everything. The last of his $78 and the entirety of the loan. Gone. For a moment, seeing the zero balance on his screen, he felt a wave of absolute terror. But it was followed by a surge of defiant adrenaline. The die was cast. The next morning felt surreal. They packed their few possessions. Clothes. Maya's favorite stuffed bear. A single framed photo of her mother, into 2 worn-out backpacks and a flimsy duffel bag. Maya, bless her innocent heart, was buzzing with excitement, chattering about their new castle. Liam forced a smile that felt like a grimace, his stomach a churning knot of anxiety. "That's right, sweetie. Our new castle." The bus ride was a long, rumbling journey into the unknown. They passed through familiar, graffiti-scarred city blocks that bled into endless monotonous suburbs, and finally into a wide, empty landscape that seemed to swallow the road whole. Liam stared out the window, watching his old life disappear behind him. The rhythmic thump of the bus's tires on the pavement was a drum beat counting down to his salvation or his ruin. Maya eventually fell asleep, her head resting on his lap, her soft breaths a fragile comfort in the rattling, impersonal belly of the bus. They disembarked in a place that felt like the world's forgotten corner. The bus pulled away in a cloud of diesel fumes. leaving them in a profound, ringing silence. The town consisted of a few boarded-up storefronts and a single, blinking traffic light that seemed to be signaling to no one. The air here was different, thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, and a pervasive loneliness that seeped into Liam's bones. He hoisted Maya, still groggy with sleep, onto his shoulders and grabbed their duffel bag. According to his phone, the address was a half-mile walk down the main, cracked road. Every step felt heavier than the last, the bag dragging on the broken pavement, the weight of his daughter on his shoulders a constant, physical reminder of the gamble he had taken with her life. The initial adrenaline had long since burned away, leaving a cold, creeping dread in its place. The sun was hidden behind a blanket of oppressive gray clouds, mirroring the storm brewing inside him. And then they saw it. The building wasn't just old. It was a skeleton. It slumped against the sky, its faded sign hanging from a single rusty chain, creaking mournfully in the slight breeze. Weeds, thick and tenacious, had conquered the parking lot, their green tendrils snaking through a web of cracks in the concrete. A large, grimy window on the front stared out like a single blind eye. It was worse than he could have possibly imagined. The blurry photos in the ad had been a kindness, a deliberate act of photographic mercy. Liam felt the forced smile melt from his face, his heart plummeting. Maya, perched on his shoulders, must have sensed his change in mood. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice small. "Is that it?" Liam couldn't answer. He could only stare at the monument to his own stupidity. The key, when he finally dug it out of his pocket, felt impossibly cold and sharp in his palm, a small metal instrument of his own self-destruction. He had traded their apartment for this tomb. He fumbled with the lock on a small, rusted side door, his hands slick with a sudden, cold sweat. The key scraped and refused to turn. For a terrifying moment, he thought they were locked out, homeless in front of their new, derelict home. He jiggled it, pushed, and finally, with a deafening screech of protesting metal, the lock gave way. As he pulled the heavy door open, a smell, a physical presence, rushed out to meet them. It was the smell of a place that had been left to die, a thick, cloying miasma of mildew, cold rust, and the sour tang of decades-old chemicals. It was so potent it made his eyes water. Maya coughed, burying her face in his shoulder. Liam stood frozen on the threshold, his body refusing to move. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to run, to take his daughter as far away from this place of decay as he could. But there was nowhere to run. He had burned the boats. This was it. This was the bottom. He took a shallow breath of the foul air and forced himself to step inside. The darkness inside was almost absolute, broken only by thin, dusty shafts of light filtering through the grime-caked windows. As his eyes adjusted, the full scope of the ruin revealed itself, and a wave of nausea rose in his throat. It was a cavern of failure. Tools, or what was left of them, were scattered across every surface, not placed, but dropped, as if their owner had simply vanished mid-task. But they weren't just tools anymore. They were corroded, orange-brown lumps, fused to the workbenches by years of damp and neglect. Liam reached out and touched a vise. It crumbled under his fingers, leaving a smear of rust and grime on his skin. He felt the damp, clammy air cling to his clothes, to his face, a disgusting film of decay. The silence in the cavernous space was broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water from an unseen leak. A slow, maddening torture counting down the seconds of his failure. This wasn't a workshop. It was a mausoleum. He forced his gaze upward, and his heart sank even further. A massive section of the corrugated tin roof had caved in, creating a jagged, gaping wound open to the gray, weeping sky. Rainwater had cascaded through the opening for years, forming a dark, stagnant pond in the far corner of the garage, its surface shimmering with a film of oil and green algae. Pigeons had made a home in the exposed rafters, their soft, mournful coos echoing through the dead space like a choir of ghosts. The dream he had so foolishly built in his mind, of a clean, bustling workshop, of happy customers, of the hum of machinery, shattered into a million pieces. He saw with brutal clarity that he hadn't bought a business opportunity. He had bought a hazardous waste site. The sheer scale of the work needed wasn't just daunting. It was impossible. It would take a fortune he didn't have, a crew he couldn't hire, and a miracle he no longer believed in. The hope was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching emptiness. His eyes fell on the machinery, the supposed heart of the operation. He walked over to a heavy-duty air compressor, its tank dented and its hoses cracked and brittle. He gave the tank a kick, and it answered with a hollow, empty thud. Beside it, a large hydraulic vehicle lift was frozen in its lowest position, a dark, viscous fluid weeping from its pistons and pooling on the floor like black blood. He ran a hand over a workbench, his fingers coming away coated in a thick, gritty paste of rust, oil, and dirt. He tried to pick up a large socket wrench, but it was cemented to the metal table by a solid bond of corrosion. Everything, absolutely everything, was a testament to terminal decay. These weren't tools, they were artifacts. They belonged in a museum of failure. A hysterical laugh threatened to bubble up from his chest. He had spent his last dollar and his friend's money on a collection of scrap metal. The weight of his colossal mistake pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. "It's big, Daddy," Maya said, her voice a small, wavering echo in the vast, gloomy space. She was trying so hard to be brave for him, and it broke his heart. He looked past her, through the grimy side door, at the world outside. There was nothing, just the empty, cracked road, and across the street, a tiny corner store with a flickering neon sign that read, "Open." There were no other houses, no signs of life. The silence from the world outside was just as oppressive and final as the decay inside. A jolt of pure panic, cold and sharp, shot through him. They were completely and utterly alone. If something happened, if Maya got sick, if he got hurt, who would they call? Who would even know they were here? The isolation was a physical wall, pressing in from all sides. He had led his daughter not to a castle, but to a prison, miles from anyone and anything that could help them. He was her only protector, and he had led her straight into a cage. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to scream. His attention snapped to the main garage bay door, the great, roll-up door he had pictured himself proudly opening each morning to welcome a new day, a new customer. It was his symbolic gateway to a new life. Now, it looked like a sealed tomb door. It was a massive sheet of corrugated metal, but its tracks were warped and swollen, coated in a thick, scaly armor of rust that looked like dragon skin. A primal need to escape, to prove it wasn't a trap, seized him. He put his shoulder to it, grunting as he pushed with every ounce of his strength. The door didn't move a millimeter. It was like pushing against a mountain. He found a long, heavy crowbar among the debris, jammed the tip into the seam where the door met the floor, and heaved. His muscles screamed and his back strained. The only result was a sickening groan of metal grinding on metal and a shower of orange rust flakes that rained down on his head. It was completely, utterly immovable. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The door wasn't just stuck, it was fused shut, welded to its frame by years of relentless water and neglect. It was no longer a door, it was a solid wall of rusted steel. The small side door they had entered through was the only way in or out of this metal box. A terrifying, claustrophobic panic began to claw at his throat. The damp, heavy air in the garage suddenly felt too thick, too solid to draw into his lungs. He felt the walls closing in, the collapsed roof pressing down. This wasn't a home. This wasn't a business. It was a trap, a tomb he had willingly paid to enter. He had sealed himself and his daughter inside his own catastrophic failure. The false hope that had burned so brightly just hours before had collapsed in on itself, leaving him buried in the cold, dark rubble of his own making. He stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He was trapped. He dropped to his knees on the filthy concrete floor, the sharp bite of loose gravel digging into the worn fabric of his jeans. The last vestiges of his desperate energy drained out of him, leaving behind a soul-deep exhaustion that felt heavier than the collapsed roof. He had gambled everything. He had thrown his last dollar, his friend's borrowed money, and his daughter's fragile security onto a single, foolish bet, and he had lost. He had lost everything. The smell of rot filled his nostrils. The damp chill seeped into his bones. The mournful cooing of the pigeons overhead sounded like a mocking eulogy for his dead dreams. He had promised his dying wife he would take care of their little girl, and he had led her here, to this derelict tomb in the middle of nowhere. A single, Hot tear of shame and despair escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. He had failed. Completely and utterly. This was rock bottom. There was nowhere left to fall. A small, warm hand landed on his trembling shoulder. Liam looked up into Maya's wide, worried eyes. "It's okay, Daddy," she whispered, her voice full of a child's pure, unwavering faith. "We can fix it." The simple, innocent words were a twisting knife in his gut. How could he tell her that it couldn't be fixed? How could he explain that her father, her hero, was a fool who had just spent their last penny on a pile of rust and ruin? He looked around at the decay, the collapsed ceiling, the door that was no longer a door. He saw no hope, no possibility, only the final, crushing proof of his own inadequacy. He had promised to protect her, to build a safe world for her. Instead, he had bought their coffin. He felt the cold, unforgiving concrete beneath him, the finality of it. He was at the absolute bottom of the pit he had dug for himself, with no ladder, no rope, and no way out. He was done. Days bled into a week of grim, Sisyphean labor. Liam, driven by a stubborn refusal to let Maya see his despair, had started the impossible task of cleaning. He worked with a silent, methodical fury, as if he could scrub the ruin itself away. He started in one corner, armed with a cracked plastic bucket and a half-rotten broom he'd found. He swept the gritty mixture of dirt, rust flakes, and crumbled plaster into small, pathetic piles. The sound was a dry, scratching whisper in the echoing silence. The only noise besides the dripping water and the cooing pigeons. He wasn't cleaning to rebuild. He was cleaning to keep from going insane. Each swept patch of concrete was a tiny, temporary victory against the overwhelming decay. It was a pointless act of defiance. He felt his muscles ache with a fatigue that went bone deep, his hands raw and blistered. His mind was a dull hum of failure, but his body kept moving, propelled by the simple, desperate need to do something. Anything to avoid sinking back to his knees in surrender. Maya, meanwhile, found ways to inhabit the ruin with the magical thinking of a child. To her, the cavernous, decaying space was not a tomb, but a vast, echoing playground. She made a castle out of a pile of rotted tires, her throne a cracked and overturned bucket. Her laughter, when it came, was a bright, shocking sound in the gloom, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the place. She treated the puddles of stagnant water like mysterious lakes, and the crumbling workbenches like treacherous mountains to be explored. Liam watched her, a painful ache in his chest. Her innocence was both a comfort and a condemnation. He was terrified of the moment her imagination would fail, the moment she would see the garage not as an adventure, but for what it truly was, a cold, dangerous, and miserable cage. For now, he clung to her make-believe world like a lifeline, letting her small stories fill the spaces where his own hope had died. He had to keep her world intact, even as his own had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He had managed to clear a small section near the center of the garage, a patch of concrete that was now merely filthy instead of being buried under debris. It was here they spent most of their time, a small island of semi-order in an ocean of chaos. Liam laid out their only blanket, and it became their living room, dining room, and bedroom. Their meager meals consisted of canned goods and bread from the small corner store across the street, purchased with the last of the money Mike had loaned him. The store's elderly owner, a man with kind, watery eyes named Arthur, would sometimes slip Maya a piece of candy, his gaze lingering on Liam with a look of deep, unspoken pity. Each trip to the store was a fresh humiliation, a reminder of their isolation and dependence. The flimsy plastic bags he carried back felt heavier with each step, weighed down not just by food, but by the crushing burden of his failure as a father and a provider. He felt the man's kindness as a brand on his skin, marking him as a charity case. One afternoon, while Liam was wrestling with a rusted shelf, trying to pry it from the wall for scrap, Maya was playing on their blanket island. She had a single, dented toy car, a little red coupe that had been a gift from her mother. It was her most prized possession. She sent it racing across the concrete, making quiet, vroom-vroom sounds that were barely audible in the vast space. Liam paused, his muscles screaming in protest, and watched her. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. She was so engrossed in her world, her small face a mask of concentration. She lined up pebbles as imaginary obstacles, her little fingers carefully navigating the car through the course. He saw a flash of his wife in her, in the focused tilt of her head, the quiet determination. The memory was a sharp, painful pang. He turned back to the shelf, his grip tightening on the metal, channeling his grief and frustration into the physical effort. The metal groaned in protest but didn't budge. It was just another part of this place that refused to yield. Then, he heard a sound that was different from the usual symphony of decay, a tiny metallic skittering, followed by a soft, uh-oh. He turned to see Maya kneeling at the edge of the blanket, peering into the darkness under a massive, unmovable workbench. "My car, Daddy," she said, her voice small and sad. "It went under there." Liam sighed, his body protesting as he straightened up. The workbench was a colossal thing, its thick wooden top scarred and stained, its heavy steel legs bolted directly into the concrete floor. It looked as old as the building itself. The space underneath was a dark cave of shadows, choked with a thick carpet of ancient grime, cobwebs, and debris that his broom couldn't reach. It was the last place on earth he wanted to put his hand. But her face, tilted up at him, was a mask of tragic, 7-year-old loss. Defeated, he got down on his hands and knees, the concrete cold and gritty against his palms. The smell of old oil and damp dust was thick and suffocating. He squinted, trying to see into the blackness. "I can't see it, sweetie," he said, his voice muffled. He took out his phone, the cracked screen a pathetic source of light, and switched on the flashlight. The beam cut a weak circle in the gloom, illuminating a landscape of filth. He could see the little red car, gleaming under a thick layer of dust, resting tantalizingly just out of reach, right against the far wall. With another heavy sigh, he lay flat on his stomach, the cold of the floor seeping through his thin shirt. The smell was worse down here, a sour, metallic stench that made him gag. He extended his arm as far as it would go, his fingers stretching through the sticky cobwebs and gritty dirt. He could feel the dust and grime coating his skin, a disgusting, greasy film. He was a man with nothing, reduced to crawling in the filth for a child's toy. The indignity of it was a fresh, sharp sting. His fingers brushed against something hard, the toy car. He stretched another inch, his muscles straining. His fingertips finally closed around the small metal car, but as he started to pull his arm back, his other fingers brushed against something else. It was cold, not the damp, seeping cold of the concrete, but a different kind of cold. A hard, clean, metallic cold that felt utterly out of place amidst the surrounding filth. A jolt of curiosity, the first real emotion he'd felt in days other than despair, cut through his exhaustion. He let go of the car and deliberately pressed his fingers against the surface again. It was smooth, solid steel, buried under the grime. He shifted his body, angling the phone's light deeper into the shadows. The beam glinted off the object, revealing not a random piece of scrap, but a perfectly flat, dark surface set flush with the concrete floor. It wasn't just under the workbench was deliberately placed on top of it, concealing it. His heart gave a strange, unfamiliar flutter, a thrum of interest that was almost hope. What was this? He forgot about the toy car, forgot about his aching muscles. He wriggled out from under the bench and got to his feet, a new energy coursing through him. "What is it, Daddy?" Maya asked, her concern for her car forgotten as she picked up on his sudden change in demeanor. "I don't know," Liam murmured, his eyes fixed on the dark space. He grabbed his broom and, using the handle, began to furiously scrape away the thick layer of grime and debris from under the bench. Thick clouds of ancient dust billowed out, making him cough and choke. But he didn't stop. He worked with a frantic intensity, the scratching of the broom a desperate, rhythmic sound. Slowly, a shape began to emerge from the filth. It was a large, rectangular plate of dark steel, perhaps 4 feet by 6 feet. It was perfectly fitted into the floor, its seams almost invisible. He lay down again, shining the light along its edge, and that's when he saw it. On one side, nearly hidden against the workbench leg, was a small, recessed ring handle, welded flush with the surface. It was designed to be overlooked. A wild, improbable idea began to form in his mind. This wasn't an accident. This was a door, a hatch, hidden deliberately and carefully. Who hides a door in the floor of a garage and then bolts a 2-ton workbench over it? His heart started to pound, a heavy, frantic beat against his ribs. The exhaustion and despair were forgotten, burned away by a sudden, intense fire of curiosity. This was a secret, and in his desperate situation, a secret felt like a promise of something other than ruin. He knew he had to open it. The workbench was immovable, but the plate was bolted down from the top. He could see the heads of several large, countersunk bolts. He scrambled over to the pile of rusted tools he had dismissed as junk, his eyes scanning them with a new purpose. He wasn't looking for a tool to fix a car anymore. He was looking for a key to unlock the first mystery this place had offered him. He found a large, heavy wrench, its jaw frozen with rust. For the next hour, he fought. He soaked the bolts in the last of some penetrating oil he'd found, the acrid smell filling the air. He hammered the wrench onto the first bolt head, the percussive clang of metal on metal echoing like gunshots in the vast, empty garage. He put his entire weight into it, his muscles screaming, his knuckles scraping raw against the concrete. The rust was like cement, a bond forged by time and neglect. For a long time, nothing happened. The bolt refused to yield. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. He felt a flash of his old despair, the familiar whisper that this, too, was a dead end. But then, with a deafening screech that grated on his teeth, the bolt moved. Just a fraction of an inch, but it moved. A surge of triumphant adrenaline shot through him. He had a chance. He worked with renewed, frantic energy, fighting for every millimeter of rotation, the sound of his ragged breathing and the shriek of tortured metal filling the air as he conquered the first bolt, and then the second. One by one, the bolts surrendered, each one a small, hard-won victory. Finally, only the rusted hinges on one side remained. He grabbed the long, heavy crowbar he had used in his futile attempt on the main garage door. It felt different in his hands now. Not a tool of desperation, but one of discovery. He wedged the tip into the seam opposite the hinges and took a deep, steadying breath. Maya watched him, her eyes wide, a silent spectator to his strange obsession. He put his back into it, heaving with a grunt. The heavy plate groaned, resisting. He pushed harder, the muscles in his back and arms burning, the crowbar flexing under the strain. For a moment, nothing happened, and then with a sudden, explosive crack of rusted metal, the seal broke. The heavy steel plate lifted a few inches, scraping against the concrete. A puff of air, smelling completely different from the air in the garage, hissed out from the gap. It wasn't the scent of mildew and rust. It was cool, dry and clean, like air from a tomb that had been perfectly sealed for an eternity. With the seal broken, the plate was easier to move. He managed to prop it open with the crowbar and then, using all his strength, lifted it and leaned it carefully against the leg of the workbench. It opened to reveal a square of absolute, impenetrable blackness, a void in the concrete floor. His phone's light seemed to be swallowed by it, revealing only the first few steps of a steep concrete staircase descending into the earth. The air that rose from the opening was cold and still, carrying a faint, sterile scent of concrete and something else, something clean and metallic. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold air traced its way down his spine. It was a mixture of fear and a thrilling, terrifying excitement. What lay at the bottom of those stairs? He felt like an archaeologist who had just broken the seal on a pharaoh's tomb. He was standing on the precipice of the unknown, and every instinct was screaming at him to go forward, to see what secrets this building had been so carefully guarding all these years. He looked at Maya, who was staring at the black hole in the floor, with a mixture of awe and fear. "Stay here, sweetie," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Right on the blanket. Don't move." She nodded, clutching her little red car to her chest. Liam took a deep breath, held his phone out like a talisman, and placed his foot on the first step. The concrete was cold and solid under his worn-out boot. He descended slowly, one step at a time, his flashlight beam cutting a nervous, bouncing path into the darkness ahead. The walls of the stairwell were smooth, poured concrete, cold and dry to the touch. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the soft crunch of his boots on the gritty steps. With each step downward, The smells of the garage above, the rust, the mildew, the decay, faded away, replaced entirely by that clean, sterile underground scent. It felt like he was descending into another world, leaving the ruin and his failure behind him on the surface. He reached the bottom, a flat concrete floor. He was in a space of complete and utter blackness. He swept the beam of his phone's light around him, and his breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a cellar. It wasn't a damp, forgotten storage room. He was standing in an immaculate, brightly lit underground garage. The light from his phone had triggered motion sensors, and panels of brilliant, white fluorescent lights flickered on one by one, flooding the space with stark, shadowless illumination. The floor was polished gray concrete, so clean he could see his reflection in it. The walls were lined with pristine, professional-grade tool chests and gleaming stainless steel countertops. In the center of the room, set flush with the floor, was a massive, industrial vehicle lift system. It was a secret, subterranean operating theater for automobiles. The sheer contrast with the squalor and decay just one floor above was so jarring it made him feel dizzy. It was impossible. It was perfect. His eyes were drawn to the 6 large, shapeless forms that dominated the space. They were arranged in 2 neat rows, each one hidden beneath a heavy, tailor-made gray dust cover. They were clearly cars, but they sat with a heavy, silent presence, like sarcophagi in a royal crypt. A profound sense of reverence and dread washed over him. He felt like he was intruding on something sacred, something that was never meant to be seen. His heart hammered in his chest, a frantic drumbeat in the pristine, silent space. Who would build this? Who would go to such incredible lengths to hide these vehicles in a climate-controlled, dust-free tomb beneath a derelict, worthless building? The question was a terrifying one, and he had a sudden, sinking feeling that the answer was far more dangerous than the discovery itself. He slowly approached the nearest covered shape, his footsteps echoing unnervingly in the sterile silence of the underground chamber. His hand trembled as he reached out and took the corner of the nearest dust sheet. The fabric was thick and heavy, cool to the touch. He took a breath, held it, and pulled. The cover slid off with a soft, whispery hiss, pooling on the polished concrete floor, and Liam forgot how to breathe. Staring back at him, gleaming under the bright fluorescent lights, was a car, but it was not just any car. It was a Shelby Cobra 427, its deep, lustrous body painted a shade of midnight blue so perfect it seemed to drink the light. The polished chrome of the side pipes, the roll bar, and the wide, knockoff wheels glinted with a blinding intensity. There was not a single speck of dust, not a fingerprint, not a scratch on its flawless surface. It was a ghost, a perfect, priceless machine frozen in time. A wave of vertigo washed over him. A car like this wasn't just valuable. It was a legend, and it was sitting here, hidden in a concrete box beneath the ruin he had bought for pocket change. He stumbled back, his mind reeling, struggling to process the impossible sight before him. He felt a hysterical laugh bubbling in his chest, a sound of pure disbelief. This had to be a dream, a hallucination brought on by hunger and despair. But the car was real. It was solid. He could smell the faint, pleasant scent of its polished leather seats and cold metal. Driven by a manic energy, he moved to the next car, then the next, tearing the covers off with a feverish haste. Each reveal was a fresh shock to his system. A fiery red Ferrari 250 GTO, its sensual curves looking more like sculpture than engineering. A silver Porsche 911 Carrera RS from the early 70s, its iconic ducktail spoiler poised as if ready to leap forward. There was a classic Aston Martin DB5, a Lamborghini Miura, and a Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, its famous doors poised like folded wings. It was a king's collection, a pirate's treasure. 6 of the most beautiful, rare, and valuable cars ever made, all in concourse condition, all hidden from the world. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of automotive perfection, and felt a cold dread seep into his bones, chilling the initial shock of discovery. This wasn't a collection. Collectors display their cars. They drive them. They show them off. This was a hoard. This was a vault. These cars hadn't been stored. They had been hidden. A dark, Terrifying logic began to click into place. The derelict shop above, the perfect hiding spot no one would ever look at twice. The incredible, secret construction of the vault itself. This wasn't the work of an eccentric hobbyist. This was the work of a professional, someone with immense resources and a powerful reason to make these specific cars disappear. He was no longer just a trespasser. He was a witness. He had stumbled into something deep, something dangerous, something that had been buried for a very, very long time. The pristine beauty of the cars suddenly took on a sinister quality. They were silent witnesses to a crime he couldn't yet comprehend. An instinctive, primal need for answers drove him forward. He approached the silver Porsche, its simple and clean line somehow more approachable than the exotic Ferrari. He pulled on the handle. The door opened with a quiet, satisfying click, the sound of perfect German engineering. He leaned in, and the smell of old, well-cared-for leather filled his senses. The interior was as immaculate as the exterior. The dashboard, with its 5 simple dials, was pristine. His eyes scanned the interior, looking for anything, any clue. He saw the small button for the glove compartment. His hand shook as he pushed it. The small door swung open with a soft, damped motion. It wasn't empty. Inside, nestled on top of a stack of original owner's manuals, was a single object. A small, handsome ledger, bound in dark brown leather, its corners worn smooth with time and handling. It felt heavy and significant in his hand. This was it. This was the key. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the answers were inside. He carried the ledger over to one of the stainless steel workbenches, placing it carefully on the cool, clean surface as if it were a sacred text. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a clinical, unforgiving glare on the worn leather. He opened it. The pages were thick, high-quality paper filled with neat, precise, handwritten script. The ink was slightly faded but perfectly legible. It was a logbook. The first page was dated nearly 40 years ago. It detailed the Shelby Cobra. The entry was chillingly simple. It listed the car's make, model, color, and then a long string of numbers and letters, the vehicle identification number. Below that was a name, Jonathan Sterling, and beside the name, a single, stark notation, reported stolen, October 12, 1984. Liam felt a chill run down his spine. He flipped the page. The Ferrari 250 GTO, a different VIN, a different name, a different date it was reported stolen. Page after page. It was the same story. 6 cars, 6 VINs, 6 owners, 6 thefts, spanning decades. He stood there, the open ledger on the bench in front of him, the silent, beautiful machines arrayed around him like evidence in a museum of crime. The truth was horrifyingly clear. This wasn't just a hidden collection. It was a graveyard of stolen masterpieces. The old mechanic who had owned this place wasn't just a recluse. He was a custodian, the keeper of these automotive ghosts. And these cars hadn't been stolen for money or for parts. The ledger, with its neat list of names, felt personal. It felt like a list of trophies. Trophies taken from specific people for a specific reason. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He had thought he'd stumbled upon a miracle, a treasure that could save him and Maya, a winning lottery ticket. But the reality was infinitely more terrifying. He had not found a solution to his problems. He had found the epicenter of a crime that had been sleeping for decades, and by opening this door, by disturbing this tomb, he had just woken it up. He was no longer just poor and desperate. Now, he was in danger. He closed the ledger with a soft thud that echoed in the silent vault. The weight of his discovery pressed down on him, a physical force that made his knees feel weak. He had to get out of here. He had to get Maya and run. But where would they go? He had no money, no resources, and now, he was in possession of a secret so enormous and so dangerous that he couldn't even begin to comprehend its full implications. The people who had orchestrated this were not petty criminals. They were powerful, meticulous, and patient, and they would undoubtedly do anything to keep this place, and its contents, a secret. He looked around the pristine garage, at the silent, gleaming cars, and felt a profound sense of terror. He had been so focused on the ruin above that he never imagined the real danger was buried beneath his feet. The derelict shop wasn't the tomb. This place, this perfect, sterile vault, was the tomb. and he had just pried open the lid, inviting whatever monster lay inside to come crawling out into the light. He carefully placed the leather-bound ledger back into the Porsche's glove compartment, his movements slow and deliberate. He couldn't leave it out. He couldn't take it with him. For now, its safest place was back where he found it, hidden inside the crime itself. He pushed the glove compartment door shut, the quiet click sounding like a cell door locking. He then moved through the room, his heart a frantic, painful drum against his ribs, and began to replace the dust covers on the cars. He worked with a grim reverence, draping the heavy gray sheets back over the flawless paint and polished chrome, plunging the beautiful machines back into their sarcophagi. With each car he covered, he felt like he was trying to put the genie back in the bottle, trying to unsee what he had seen. But it was too late. The knowledge was a poison in his veins. The pristine garage, which had seemed like a miracle just minutes ago, now felt like a crime scene. And by being there, he had made himself a part of it. He was now inextricably linked to this dark, decades-old secret. As he covered the last car, the beautiful and sinister Shelby Cobra, he paused. The silence of the vault was no longer peaceful or sterile. It was heavy with menace. He could almost feel the presence of the men who had built this place, their ghosts lingering in the cool, dry air. He imagined them, powerful and ruthless, stealing these cars not for profit but for punishment, for the sheer exercise of power. The names in the ledger were not just names. They were victims, people who had crossed someone they should have feared. He backed away from the cars, towards the concrete stairs that led back to his world of decay and poverty, a world that suddenly seemed infinitely safer than this subterranean chamber of perfect, dangerous secrets. He had descended into this vault hoping for a miracle, a lifeline to pull him out of his desperation. Instead, he had found an anchor, a weight that threatened to pull him down into a darkness far deeper and more terrifying than he had ever imagined. He turned his back on the covered cars and began to climb the stairs, his legs feeling heavy and weak, as if he were wading through water. Each step up was a step back towards his bleak reality, but it was also a step away from the terrifying mystery he had unearthed. When he reached the top, he looked back down one last time into the brightly lit, sterile chamber, a secret world of immense wealth and immense danger, before pulling the heavy steel plate back into place. It settled into its frame with a deep, resonant boom that echoed in his chest, sealing the secret once more. He didn't bother replacing the bolts. He knew it was a futile gesture. The secret wasn't contained by a steel plate anymore. It was inside his head. He looked over at Maya, who had fallen asleep on the blanket, her face peaceful and innocent. A fierce, protective wave washed over him, followed by a new kind of terror. The danger was no longer about eviction or hunger. He had stumbled into a world of powerful, hidden enemies, and he had just put his daughter right in their path. The secret lay beneath the floorboards like a sleeping dragon, and Liam felt its heat. He paced the small, cleared patch of concrete, the island in his sea of ruin, a caged animal. His mind was a frantic shuttle, racing between the squalor of his reality, the smell of damp and decay, the constant drip of water, and the impossible, sterile perfection of the vault below. The contrast was a form of madness. He would find himself staring at the monstrous workbench, the innocent-looking slab of wood and steel, and a wave of vertigo would wash over him. He could feel the weight of the 6 cars, the sheer mass of their value and their history, pressing up from beneath the ground. The air in the garage felt thin, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm clouds gathering outside and everything to do with the storm gathering inside him. The silence was no longer empty. It was waiting. His desperation had a new, sharper edge. It was no longer just about survival. It was about understanding the nature of the beast he had awoken. He slid to the floor, leaning his back against a pile of rotted tires, and pulled out his phone. The battery icon glowed a menacing red. 14%. He ignored the frantic warning in his own head telling him to conserve it, to save it for an emergency. This was the emergency. His fingers, stained with grease and grime, felt clumsy on the cracked glass screen. He typed in the first name from the ledger, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Jonathan Sterling. Then he added the key details, his voice a choked whisper in the gloom. Stolen Shelby Cobra 1984. The signal was weak, the loading bar creeping across the screen with agonizing slowness. Each percentage point felt like a drop of water in a desert, a tiny piece of a puzzle he was terrified to solve. The page finally loaded, and Liam felt the air leave his lungs in a single, silent rush. The story that unfolded on the small, glowing screen was colder and more brutal than he could have imagined. Jonathan Sterling wasn't just a car enthusiast. He was a crusading city councilman, a man who had built his reputation on integrity. In the early 1980s, he was the sole, vocal opponent of a massive and controversial downtown redevelopment project, one that promised to displace thousands of low-income residents. The articles from the time painted him as a David against a corporate Goliath. Then, one night, his prized 1966 Shelby Cobra 427, a car he had spent a decade restoring with his own hands, vanished from his triple-locked garage. There was no sign of forced entry. It was, as one reporter wrote, as if it had been plucked from the earth by a ghost. Weeks later, a visibly broken Jonathan Sterling withdrew all his objections. The project went through. The articles never named the developer, but they didn't have to. The car wasn't stolen for money. It was stolen to surgically remove a man's soul. A cold dread, slick and oily, began to creep up Liam's spine. He felt a sick sense of recognition. This was a pattern. This was a signature. He typed in the next name from the ledger, a woman named Elena Vance, no relation it seemed. The search results were just as chilling. Elena was an award-winning investigative journalist for the city's main paper. In 1992, she was working on a bombshell series exposing widespread zoning fraud and kickbacks that benefited a single powerful real estate consortium. The night before her first article was set to print, her Porsche 911 Carrera RSA, a car famous around the city and a gift from her late father, disappeared from a secure parking garage. The series was mysteriously pulled. Elena quit journalism a month later and moved out of state. Liam scrolled further. The architect who wouldn't sell. The judge who ruled against a specific corporate interest. The story was the same, repeated over and over through the decades. A car disappears. A life is ruined. A powerful man gets his way. And through the faded digital ink of these decades-old stories, one name began to emerge from the shadows. It was whispered in some articles, hinted at in others, but always present, a ghost in the machine of the city's history, Mr. Silas Vance. Today, he was a titan, a revered philanthropist whose name adorned university halls and hospital wings. But 40 years ago, he was the young, hungry developer behind the very project Councilman Sterling had opposed. His holding companies had mysteriously benefited from the zoning changes the journalist Elena had been investigating. He had eventually acquired the stubborn architect's land for pennies on the dollar after the man was financially ruined. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The benevolent old billionaire, the city's favorite son, was a predator, a monster who collected not just cars, but people's broken wills. He wasn't just a thief. He was a king who demanded tribute. And his trophies were the souls of his enemies. The sound, when it came, was so alien to this dead-end street that Liam's entire body went rigid. It wasn't the groan of rusting metal or the drip of water. It was the low, purring growl of a powerful, modern engine, the sound of wealth and purpose. His blood turned to ice water in his veins. He scrambled to his feet, every nerve screaming. He peered through a filthy section of the large front window, his heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm against his ribs. A gleaming black Mercedes sedan, polished to a mirror shine, was parked in the cracked lot where only weeds had grown for years. The car itself was an act of intimidation, a statement of power in this kingdom of decay. The engine purred for a moment longer before cutting out, plunging the world back into a silence that now felt heavy, loaded, and infinitely more menacing than before. They were here. The ghosts of the vault were no longer sleeping. They had come for him. A man emerged from the driver's side. He was not what Liam expected. There were no bulky muscles or cheap suits. This man was elegance personified. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit that probably cost more than Liam's dead van. His silver hair was perfectly cut, and he moved with a slow, deliberate grace, an economy of motion that spoke of absolute confidence. He shut the car door with a soft, expensive thud that seemed to mock the ruin around it. He didn't look at the collapsed roof or the boarded windows. He looked at the building itself, a long, appraising gaze, like a lord surveying a minor, troublesome part of his estate. It wasn't a look of surprise. It was a look of ownership. Liam felt a tremor of pure fear run through him. This was not a random visitor. This man knew exactly where he was, and he had come with a purpose. Liam shrank back from the window, his back pressing against the cold, grimy wall. The man didn't even try the massive, rusted-shut garage door. He walked with a calm, unhurried stride directly towards the small, dilapidated side entrance, his polished Italian shoes gliding over the cracked concrete. The certainty of his path was the most terrifying thing of all. He knew the layout. He had been here before. Liam's mind spun, a whirlwind of panicked questions. How did they find him so fast? Did they know he'd been in the vault? A sharp, commanding rap on the metal door echoed through the garage like a gunshot. Knock. Knock. Liam froze, every muscle in his body locked in a state of high alert. He could hear his own ragged breathing, loud and harsh in the silence. From the blanket on the floor, Maya whimpered in her sleep, disturbed by the sound. The noise had violated their fragile sanctuary. Another knock, louder this time, more insistent. An order, not a request. Liam knew he couldn't hide. The time for hiding was over. He forced his trembling legs to move, his body a battlefield of terror and a desperate, paternal instinct to protect. He pulled the heavy side door open just a few inches, using his own body as a barricade. The man outside stood there, framed against the bleak gray sky. His eyes, a pale, cold blue, met Liam's. They held no surprise, only a calm, analytical intelligence. Liam O'Connell. The man's voice was like silk sliding over steel, smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. My name is Marcus Thorne. I represent a client who has a keen interest in this property. Liam couldn't find his voice. The words were trapped in his throat, choked by a knot of pure fear. He just stared, gripping the edge of the door so tightly his knuckles were white. The man, Thorne, offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a facial expression, a mask, nothing more. It would be in your best interest to hear our proposal. May I? He gestured gracefully towards the interior of the garage. Reluctantly, feeling he had no other choice, Liam stepped back, pulling the door open. Thorne entered, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere of the room. He was a creature of a different world, a predator that had wandered into a cage of mice. His cool, detached gaze swept across the decay, the puddles of stagnant water, the mountains of rusted scrap, the gaping hole in the roof, with an air of complete disinterest. Then his eyes landed on Maya, a small, still form under the thin blanket. His gaze lingered there for a beat too long, and a surge of hot, protective rage burned through Liam's fear. It was a calculated glance, a subtle reminder of the stakes. A sentimental attachment, Thorne said, his voice a low purr as he finally turned his gaze back to Liam. My client knew the previous owner, Mr. Hemlock. For old times' sake, he's prepared to make you a very generous offer to buy the property back, to help you out of this unfortunate situation. Thorne named a figure. The number hit Liam like a physical blow. It was more money than he had ever seen in his life. It was a key. It was the solution to every problem that had been crushing him. With that money, he could get a real home for Maya, a safe place with clean sheets and a full refrigerator. He could pay back Mike, buy a working vehicle, and start a small, legitimate business. He could give his daughter the life he had promised his wife he would provide. The offer was a bright, seductive light at the end of a very dark tunnel. He felt the immense gravitational pull of it. All he had to do was say yes. Say yes, take the money, and forget. Forget the cars. Forget the ledger. Forget the name Silas Vance. He could take his daughter and run, leaving the ghosts and their secrets buried forever. The temptation was so powerful, so overwhelming, it made him feel dizzy. He could almost taste the relief. The lawyer's voice was a soft, insidious whisper, weaving a web of false sincerity. My client is a philanthropist, Mr. O'Connell. He heard about your situation, a single father trying to make a fresh start. He understands that you may have overextended yourself in purchasing this asset. He wants to help. Consider it an act of charity. The word charity hung in the foul air, a grotesque mockery of the truth. Liam looked at the man's expensive suit, his cold eyes, and saw the lie for what it was. This wasn't about sentiment. This wasn't about charity. This was about the multi-million-dollar secret buried 6 feet beneath the concrete they were standing on. They were trying to buy his silence. They assumed he was just some desperate fool, easily bought and discarded. The offer wasn't a helping hand. It was a muzzle, lined with cash. They didn't know that he knew. They didn't know he had already opened the tomb. A new feeling, unfamiliar and dangerous, began to smolder in the pit of Liam's stomach, burning through the thick fog of his fear. It was a spark of defiance, of anger. He thought of Jonathan Sterling, his spirit broken. He thought of Elena Vance, her career destroyed. He thought of the nameless, faceless people whose lives had been systematically dismantled by the man this lawyer served. He then looked over at Maya, her small chest rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm of sleep. Taking this money would make him one of them. It would make him another victim who chose silence, another cog in Vance's machine of intimidation. "I'll think about it," Liam heard himself say. The words came out raspy, barely a whisper, but they felt as heavy as stone. It was a pathetic act of rebellion, but it was his. For a split second, he had chosen the ghosts over the gold. The lawyer's practiced smile didn't falter, but a subtle shift occurred. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. The coldness in his eyes intensified, like a lens focusing a deadly beam. "I would advise you not to think for very long," Thorne said, his voice losing all its manufactured warmth. It was flat, hard, and sharp as broken glass. He took a half-step closer, his presence suddenly suffocating. His gaze deliberately flicked from Liam to the sleeping form of Maya, and then back again. The meaning was unmistakable. "This is an old, unstable building, Mr. O'Connell, structurally unsound. It would be a terrible shame if an accident were to happen here." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting them fester, especially with such a lovely little girl on the premises. A real tragedy. All because her father couldn't make a simple decision. The threat, no longer veiled, hung in the air like poison gas. Accidents happen. It was a death sentence delivered with a polite smile. Thorne gave a slight, dismissive nod, as if closing a business deal. He turned without another word and walked out, his footsteps silent on the grimy floor. The soft thud of the Mercedes door closing was the final punctuation mark. Liam stood paralyzed, his heart a block of ice in his chest. The lawyer's words echoed in his mind, looping over and over. He was trapped. He looked at the massive workbench, the gateway to the truth. Then he looked at his daughter, his reason for living. He was standing at a crossroads from hell. He could take the blood money, ensuring his and Maya's safety, but condemning the truth to be buried forever. Or he could refuse, standing up for victims he'd never met, and in doing so, paint a target on his own back and, worse, on Maya's. What would you do? Would you take the deal to protect your family at all costs? Or would you risk everything for a chance at justice? The lawyer's black Mercedes disappeared down the cracked road, leaving behind a silence thick with poison. The air in the garage felt heavy, unbreathable, saturated with the echo of Thorne's final words. Accidents happen. Liam stood frozen, not from cold, but from a terror so profound it felt like a total system failure. His blood was ice, his muscles were stone. The generous cash offer, once a seductive lifeline, now felt like a shroud he was being offered to wrap himself and his daughter in. He looked at the massive workbench. The secret it concealed now a radioactive core leaking danger into their lives. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to grab Maya, and simply vanish. But the man's veiled threat had been surgically precise. They knew he was here. They knew he had a daughter. There was no running from men like that. They didn't chase you. They simply waited for you to fall into the traps they set everywhere. A wave of nausea, potent and acidic, rose in his throat. He was no longer just a failure. He was a liability to his own child. A small whimper pulled him from his paralysis. Maya was stirring on the blanket, her brow furrowed in a troubled sleep. Her small, innocent face was a beacon in the suffocating gloom, and the sight of it ignited a new fire in him, a desperate, primal rage that burned away the edges of his fear. He would not let them touch her. He would not let his foolish gamble be the end of her. He stumbled towards her, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and knelt by the blanket. His hands were shaking so violently he had to clench them into fists. He had to think. He couldn't stay here. This place, this tomb, was now a target. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every creak of the dying building a footstep. He scooped Maya up into his arms, her small body warm and pliant against his chest. She mumbled something in her sleep and snuggled into his shoulder. The weight of her trust was both an immense comfort and an unbearable burden. He had to get her somewhere safe, somewhere the ghosts of Silas Vance couldn't reach. His mind raced, a chaotic scramble for a sanctuary that didn't exist. He had no friends here, no family, no one. His gaze fell on the grimy window, and through it, he saw the only other sign of life in this forgotten place. The flickering neon sign of the corner store across the street. Open. It was a pathetic beacon, but it was the only one he had. The old man, Arthur. The man with the kind, pitying eyes. It was a desperate, foolish hope. A drowning man reaching for a single strand of seaweed. But it was all he had. He grabbed their worn duffel bag with his free hand, stuffing the single blanket inside. He didn't know what he would say to the old man, how he could possibly explain the sophisticated, invisible danger that was closing in on him. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not spend one more second in this garage. It was no longer a ruin. It was a hunting ground, and they were the prey. He took one last look at the workbench, the source of all his terror, and fled into the gray, fading light of the afternoon. The short walk across the cracked asphalt of the road felt like a journey across a barren moonscape. The air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of impending rain. Liam clutched Maya tightly, his body a shield against a world that had suddenly become hostile and predatory. The bell above the corner store's door gave a cheerful, tinkling jingle as he pushed it open, a sound so normal and out of place with the terror in his heart that it was jarring. The inside of the store was a warm, cluttered haven. It smelled of freshly brewed coffee, old newspapers, and the sweet scent of the penny candy displayed in large glass jars on the counter. It was the smell of a life lived, of routine and simple comforts. Arthur was behind the counter, a small, stooped man with a nimbus of white hair, carefully polishing the glass of a display case with a soft cloth. He looked up as Liam entered, his movements slow and deliberate. The kind, watery blue eyes registered Liam's disheveled appearance, the sleeping child in his arms, and the raw panic simmering just beneath his skin. "Son," Arthur's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, gentle but perceptive. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Liam's hollow laugh was a dry, cracking sound. "Ghosts," he croaked, his voice raw. "Yeah, you could say that." He swayed slightly on his feet, the adrenaline that had propelled him across the street suddenly draining away, leaving him weak and trembling. Arthur moved from behind the counter with a surprising quickness for a man his age. He took Liam by the elbow, his grip firm and steady. "Here," he said, guiding him toward a small, wobbly table in the corner, where two mismatched chairs sat waiting. "Sit down. Put the little one on your lap. You're as white as a sheet." Liam collapsed into the chair, the wood groaning in protest. He carefully situated Maya on his knees, her head lolling against his chest. The warmth of the store, the smell of the coffee, the simple human kindness from this stranger. It was all too much. He felt a hot pressure build behind his eyes, and he fought it back with a grim determination. He couldn't fall apart. Not now. Arthur disappeared for a moment and returned with a steaming ceramic mug. He pressed it into Liam's trembling hands. "It's just coffee," he said, "but it's hot and strong." Liam wrapped his cold fingers around the mug, the warmth a small, anchoring comfort in the sea of his terror. He took a sip, the bitter, hot liquid scalding his throat but steadying his nerves. He didn't know where to begin. How could he explain the hidden vault, the priceless cars, the billionaire philanthropist who was also a monster? The story was too wild, too insane. He would sound like a lunatic. He looked up at Arthur, who was watching him with an expression of deep, patient concern. There was no judgment in the old man's eyes, only a quiet invitation to speak. "I'm in trouble," Liam whispered, the words a stark, pathetic admission. "I made a mistake coming here, a terrible, terrible mistake." The old man simply nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Trouble has a way of finding people in that old garage," he said softly. It's been that way for a long time. The old man's words, the calm acceptance in his voice, broke through Liam's wall of silence. The story came pouring out of him, a torrent of frantic, jumbled words. He told Arthur everything. The false hope, the crushing disappointment of the ruin, the discovery of the metal plate, the descent into the pristine impossible vault. He described the 6 perfect cars, gleaming like jewels in a tomb. He told him about the ledger, the names, the stolen dates, and then, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper, he described the visit from the lawyer, the cash offer that felt like a death threat, the cold, calculated mention of his daughter. He spoke for a long time, the words tumbling over each other in his desperation to make this man understand. Through it all, Arthur just listened. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression growing grimmer and more somber with every detail Liam revealed. When Liam finally fell silent, exhausted and spent, the only sound in the store was the hum of the refrigerator and the soft patter of rain beginning to fall outside. Arthur let out a long, slow breath, a sound full of ancient weariness. He pulled the other chair from the table and sat down heavily, his old joints protesting with a faint creak. He stared past Liam, his gaze unfocused, as if he were looking back through the decades. Silas Vance, he murmured, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. I always knew Hemlock wasn't the real devil in that place. He was just the groundskeeper for hell. Arthur leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You mentioned a Porsche, a silver 911 Carrera, and a name in that book, Eleanor Vance? Liam nodded dumbly, his heart pounding. Yes, he said. How did you know? Arthur's eyes glistened with a deep, old sadness. Because I knew her. I knew her father, too. George Vance. No relation to Silas, thank God. George was a good man. Owned the hardware store down the block, back when there was a block. Elena. She was a firecracker. Smart as a whip. She used to come in here for licorice sticks when she was a little girl. Not much older than your Maya. Her father, George, gave her that Porsche for her college graduation. Arthur continued, his voice thick with memory. He'd saved for years. It was his pride and joy, seeing her in that car. She loved it more than anything. And she was a damn good reporter, you know, a real truth-teller. She was digging into Silas Vance's business dealings, back when he was still building his empire on broken promises and bulldozed neighborhoods. She found things, dirty things, the kind of things that could tear a man like Vance down. Arthur shook his head slowly. A deep sadness etched into the lines of his face. She told her father she was close to publishing the story. That same week, the Porsche vanished from a locked garage downtown. Poof, gone without a trace. It broke her spirit. It was like he'd reached into her chest and stolen a piece of her father's love. She dropped the story, left town a month later. I never saw her again. He looked at Liam, his eyes sharp and clear. Vance doesn't just crush his enemies. He takes what they love most and puts it on his mantelpiece. A cold, hard clarity settled over Liam. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the full picture it revealed was more monstrous than he could have imagined. Arthur's story gave a face and a soul to the name and the ledger. It made the crime real, personal, and infinitely more evil. These weren't just cars. They were stolen memories, stolen legacies, stolen spirits, all locked away in a rich man's private museum of cruelty. The rage that had been simmering inside him now boiled over, hot and pure. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was no longer in control. He looked at Maya, sleeping peacefully in his arms, her breath a warm puff against his neck. He thought of her little red toy car, her most prized possession. The thought of someone taking that from her, just to hurt him, just to prove a point, was an unbearable violation. In that moment, the fight was no longer about him or his survival. It was for Elena Vance and Jonathan Sterling and all the other ghosts in Silas Vance's ledger. It was for his daughter. What do I do? Arthur? Liam asked, his voice shaking but laced with a new steel. I have no money, nowhere to go. They'll be back. I know they will. The old man was silent for a long moment, the only sound the steady drumming of the rain on the store's roof. He looked from Liam's determined face to Maya's sleeping form, and a decision seemed to form in his weary eyes. There's only one thing you can do, son, he said, his voice low and firm. People like Vance, they control the city. They control the local police. You can't go to them, but they can't control everyone. That journalist you read about, the one whose prize-winning car vanished? His daughter, she's not a journalist. She's a federal prosecutor now, specializes in organized crime. She spent her whole career waiting for a chance to get the man who destroyed her father. Arthur scribbled a number on a napkin. This is her office line, but you can't just call. You need more than a story. You need proof. Hard, undeniable proof. Liam stared at the napkin in his hand. A name and a number, another desperate hope. The ledger, he breathed. The VINs. The car itself. Arthur nodded grimly. One of the cars, and the book that tells its story. That's your sword and your shield, son. If you can get that car and that ledger to her, you might just have a chance to burn his whole rotten kingdom to the ground. A plan, insane and terrifying, began to form in Liam's mind. It was a suicide mission, a kamikaze run against an empire. He would have to go back to the garage, back to the vault. He would have to steal one of the stolen cars. The irony was not lost on him. He looked out the window. The rain was coming down harder now, washing the grimy street in sheets of gray. The sky was dark, night falling with a grim finality. It was time. He had to go back before Vance's men did. He looked at Arthur, a deep gratitude welling in his chest. This old man, this stranger, had given him more than a story. He had given him a weapon. He had given him a direction. "Thank you, Arthur," Liam said, his voice thick with emotion. He stood up, settling Maya more comfortably against his shoulder. He tucked the napkin with the prosecutor's number into his pocket like a holy relic. Arthur simply nodded, his face a mask of worry and hope. "You be careful. Son, Silas Vance didn't get where he is by letting people walk away." As Liam pushed the door open, the cheerful jingle of the bell sounded again, a stark and absurd counterpoint to the danger that awaited him. The cold, wet air hit him like a slap in the face, a brutal return to reality. The short walk back across the street was a march into enemy territory. The garage loomed in the deepening twilight, no longer just a ruin, but a fortress he had to breach, a dragon's lair from which he had to steal a single piece of treasure. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat counting down the final, desperate moments before the battle began. He was terrified, but for the first time in a long time, he was not lost. He had a purpose. He had a target. He slipped back into the garage through the side door, the familiar stench of mildew and rust a strangely comforting welcome. It was his ruin, his battlefield. He gently laid Maya down on the blanket, tucking it around her sleeping form. "I'll be right back, sweetie," he whispered, his voice a soft promise in the dark. Just a few minutes. He didn't have a few minutes. He had moments, at best. He knew Vance's men would not wait for his answer. The threat had been a final warning, not the start of a negotiation. They would be back tonight, and not to talk. They would come to take the cars and to erase the problem. Him, and his daughter. He moved with a swift, silent purpose, his body thrumming with a nervous, high-octane energy. He grabbed the heavy crowbar, its cold, pitted steel a familiar weight in his hand. He went to the workbench, to the hidden door. It was time to descend into hell one last time, not as a victim, but as a thief. He was going to steal back a piece of the past and use it to destroy the future of Silas Vance. The vault was exactly as he had left it, the motion sensor lights flickering on to reveal the 6 silent shrouded forms. The sterile perfection of the place felt different now, not just menacing but fragile. He knew its secret, and that knowledge felt like a form of power. He didn't have time to choose carefully. He went to the Porsche, the car from Arthur's story. Elena's car. It felt right. He pulled the cover off, the silver paint gleaming with a ghostly light. He opened the driver's side door. The familiar scent of old leather, a tangible link to the past, to the woman whose life was shattered. He reached into the glove compartment, his fingers closing around the worn leather of the ledger. He shoved it into the waistband of his jeans, the hard spine of the book pressing against his skin, a constant, physical reminder of his mission. He then looked at the dashboard. No keys. Of course there were no keys. A fresh wave of panic threatened to overwhelm him. How could he be so stupid? How could he get the car out without a key? He frantically searched the car, his hands patting down the seats, checking under the floor mats, his mind racing. Nothing. He stepped out of the Porsche, his gaze sweeping across the pristine workshop. His eyes landed on a large, locked metal cabinet on the far wall. A key cabinet. It had to be. He ran to it, grabbing the crowbar. He didn't have time for finesse. He jammed the tip of the crowbar into the seam of the cabinet door and heaved with all his might. The metal shrieked in protest, a sound that seemed deafeningly loud in the silent vault. The lock broke with a loud crack, and the door swung open. Inside, hanging on neat, labeled hooks, were 6 sets of car keys, each with a small, typed tag: Shelby Cobra, Ferrari GTO, Porsche 911. A hysterical laugh escaped his lips. The arrogance, the sheer, meticulous arrogance of Silas Vance. He grabbed the keys to the Porsche, the cold metal a perfect, solid weight in his palm. He had it. He had everything he needed. He sprinted back to the Porsche, the keys clutched in his hand. He slid into the driver's seat, the worn leather molding around him. The cockpit felt like a fighter jet, a machine built for speed and purpose. He inserted the key into the ignition. He paused, his hand hovering over the key, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the rain drumming on the ground far above him. He was about to do something irrevocable, something that would change his life and Maya's forever. There was no turning back after this. He took a deep breath, held it, and turned the key. The engine, silent for decades, coughed once, then roared to life with a deep, throaty growl that vibrated through the entire car, through the floor, through his very bones. It was the sound of a sleeping giant awakening, a sound of righteous, beautiful fury, the sound of a ghost coming back to claim its due. He was no longer Liam O'Connell, failed delivery driver. He was a getaway driver for a vengeful spirit. The sound of the Porsche's engine, a guttural roar in the confined space, was a declaration of war. He knew anyone upstairs would have heard it. Time was up. He looked at the control panel for the vehicle lift, a series of large, industrial buttons set into the wall near the stairs. It was simple, designed for function. An up arrow, a down arrow, and a large, red emergency stop. He revved the engine once more, a surge of power that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Then, from above, came a new sound, a loud metallic bang, followed by a scraping noise. It was the sound of a crowbar against the main garage door. They were here. His blood ran cold. The thugs were back, and they were no longer knocking. They were breaking in. He had to move now. He threw the Porsche into neutral, set the parking brake, and scrambled out of the car, leaving the engine running, a throbbing, pulsing heartbeat in the sterile vault. He sprinted to the control panel, his hand hovering over the UP button. The sounds from above grew more frantic, more violent, a series of heavy, rhythmic thuds. They were using a sledgehammer now, or maybe the bumper of their truck. The main door, the one he couldn't budge, was groaning under the assault, the sound of tortured metal echoing down into the vault. Liam's mind was a whirlwind of terror and calculation. He had to time this perfectly. If he went up too soon, they'd see him rising. If he waited too long, they'd be inside, waiting for him. He pictured the garage above, the position of the lift directly in front of the main door. A crazy, desperate, impossible idea bloomed in his mind. The door was a wall, but walls can be broken. He looked at the powerful, gleaming machine purring on the lift, a silver bullet in a concrete chamber. It wasn't just his escape, it was his battering ram. The plan was suicidal. It was brilliant. It was the only way out. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of exhaust fumes and ozone. He jumped back into the Porsche, the leather seat cool against his sweat-dampened shirt. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The engine's powerful thrum was a comforting vibration, a promise of violence. He could hear Maya's soft breathing in his memory, see her trusting face. This was for her. He leaned out the open door, his arm stretched towards the lift controls. His fingers found the cool, plastic surface of the UP button. From above, a final, deafening crash, followed by the screech of tearing metal. They were in. He could hear their footsteps on the concrete floor above, their voices, low and guttural. Boss said, "Check the cellar first." The words, muffled but clear, were a death sentence. They knew. They knew about the vault. He didn't hesitate. He jammed his finger down on the UP button and held it there as he pulled his arm back in and slammed the Porsche's door shut. The world lurched. With a powerful, hydraulic hiss, the massive platform began to rise. The ascent was surprisingly fast. The brilliant lights of the vault receded below, plunging him into the gloom of the stairwell shaft. He was rising up into the darkness, towards the sounds of his enemies. He could see the square of the opening above him, a patch of gray in the blackness, growing larger and larger. He gripped the steering wheel, his foot hovering over the accelerator. The sounds of the thugs were closer now, right above him. "What the hell is that noise?" one of them grunted. "Sounds like a lift?" The platform cleared the opening and settled into place on the main garage floor with a solid, heavy thud. He was back in the world of decay and rust, but now he was encased in a silver shell of German steel. Through the windshield, he saw them. Two large, hulking shapes, momentarily frozen in surprise, their faces illuminated by the Porsche's headlights. They stood between him and the mangled, half-open garage door, crowbars held in their hands like weapons. They were stunned, but only for a second. One of them recovered first. A brutish man with a shaved head and a thick neck. He let out a yell of rage and disbelief and started towards the car, raising his crowbar to smash the windshield. There was no time to think, only to act. Liam stomped his foot down on the clutch, slammed the car into first gear, and floored the accelerator. The Porsche's rear tires screamed in protest against the polished steel of the lift platform, then bit hard. The car leaped forward with a ferocity that threw Liam back into his seat. The thug with the crowbar had a look of pure shock on his face as he dove out of the way just in time. The second man was not so lucky. Liam didn't aim for him, but the man was standing in the path of his escape. The corner of the car clipped him, sending him spinning into a pile of rusted metal parts with a sickening thud and a cry of pain. Liam didn't look back. His eyes were fixed on the prize, the mangled, broken main door, the gateway to freedom. The garage was a blur of shadows and debris. The Porsche, a machine of grace and precision, became a blunt instrument of escape. Liam braced himself for impact, his entire body rigid. He was aiming for the largest opening in the mangled door, a jagged tear where the thugs had breached it. The car hit the weakened metal barrier with a deafening, explosive crash. The sound was a symphony of destruction. The shriek of tearing steel, the shatter of the remaining glass in the door's small windows, the roar of the Porsche's engine. The car bucked and groaned, but its momentum was unstoppable. It punched through the rusted metal wall as if it were made of paper, tearing a car-shaped hole in the side of the building. For a terrifying second, the car was airborne as it cleared the concrete lip of the garage floor and slammed down onto the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, its suspension groaning in protest. The impact jarred every bone in Liam's body, but he didn't slow down. He was out. He was free. He wrenched the steering wheel hard to the right, the tires squealing on the wet pavement. He caught a glimpse of the black SUV the thugs had arrived in, parked near the road. The surviving goon was already scrambling out of the garage, shouting into a phone, his face a mask of fury. Liam didn't wait to see what would happen next. He stomped on the gas, and the Porsche shot forward, its powerful engine a triumphant roar in the night. The rain was coming down in sheets now, smearing the windshield, but the wipers, even after decades of disuse, worked perfectly. He flew past the corner store, a warm yellow rectangle in the dark, a bastion of sanity in a world gone mad. He risked a glance in the rearview mirror. He could see the headlights of the SUV flick on, followed by the bright, angry flash of its light bar. They were coming after him. The brief, euphoric moment of escape was over. The hunt had begun. He tightened his grip on the wheel, the ledger a hard, reassuring rectangle against his side, and sped into the stormy, unforgiving night. He didn't know where the federal prosecutor's office was. He only knew he had to keep moving. He had to put distance between himself and the monster he had woken up. The silver Porsche, a ghost car from a bygone era, sliced through the darkness, its engine a powerful heartbeat against the rhythm of the pounding rain. He thought of Arthur, the old man who had armed him with the truth. He had to honor that trust. He had to see this through. He was no longer just running away from something. He was driving towards something, towards justice, towards a reckoning that was 40 years in the making. The road stretched out before him, a wet, black ribbon leading into the unknown. The headlights of the SUV were still in his mirror, two angry eyes getting closer. The terror was still there, a cold, hard knot in his stomach, but now it was mixed with something else, a fierce, burning resolve. He had the truth in his car and the evidence in his pocket. He was a father, a thief, and a witness, all rolled into one, and he was about to deliver a ghost to the front door of justice. The needle on the speedometer climbed higher, the engine's roar drowning out the sound of his own frantic heartbeat. The pristine streets of the city's wealthy suburbs gave way to the gritty, rain-slicked asphalt of the industrial districts. He drove with a desperate, focused clarity he had never known before. Every turn, every red light he ran, was a calculated risk. The SUV was still behind him, a relentless predator, but Liam knew this city's forgotten corners better than they did. He had delivered packages to every dark alley and dead-end street. He was on his home turf now. He ducked into a labyrinth of narrow one-way streets, the Porsche's agile frame a stark contrast to the bulky SUV. He could see their headlights getting confused, falling back. He was using his old life, the one he had thought was a failure, to fuel his escape. It was a small, bitter irony, but it gave him a sliver of hope. He wasn't just running anymore. He was fighting back with the only weapons he had: a stolen car, a book of secrets, and a deep, intimate knowledge of the city's underbelly. Liam glanced at the fuel gauge. The needle was hovering just above empty. The car, after decades of sitting, had likely been stored with a nearly dry tank to protect the engine. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in his chest. The SUV was falling behind, but he was running on fumes. He had to get to Arthur's. It was the only place he could think of, the only place that felt remotely safe. It was a crazy risk, doubling back towards the hornet's nest, but his options were dwindling with every drop of gasoline. He swung the Porsche through a series of tight turns, the tires protesting on the wet pavement, using his knowledge of the back streets to loop around the industrial park. He cut his headlights, driving by the dim, jaundiced glow of the streetlights, turning the silver car into a gray ghost that blended with the rain and shadows. He had to trust that Arthur would help him one more time. He was betting his life, and Maya's, on the kindness of a man he barely knew. It was another desperate gamble in a night full of them, but it was the only play he had left. He saw the familiar, flickering sign of the corner store ahead. The lights were still on. A profound sense of relief washed over him, so potent it almost made him weak. He coasted the last 100 yards, the engine sputtering, and pulled the Porsche into the shadows of the alley beside the store, killing the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the drumming of the rain on the roof and his own ragged breathing. He had made it. For now, he looked in the rearview mirror. The street was empty. The SUV was gone, lost in the maze he had led them through. He grabbed the ledger from his waistband and scrambled out of the car, the cold rain soaking him instantly. He ran to the front door of the store, his hand fumbling for the handle. The bell above the door gave its cheerful, incongruous jingle as he burst inside, a wild, dripping specter in the warm, dry haven. Arthur was standing by the window, peering out into the night, his face a mask of deep anxiety. He turned as Liam entered, his eyes wide. "I called her," Arthur said, his voice a strained whisper. "She's on her way." The air in the corner store was a pocket of warmth and sanity in a world gone mad. Liam sat hunched over the small table, soaked to the bone, the cold rain forming a puddle on the linoleum floor around his chair. Maya slept peacefully in his lap, oblivious to the tempest her father had unleashed, her small body a warm, precious weight. On the table between Liam and Arthur, the leather ledger sat like a dark heart, its secrets now exposed and pulsing with danger. Liam's hands trembled, not from cold, but from the violent adrenaline crash that left him feeling hollowed out and raw. He could hear every sound with supernatural clarity: the soft hum of the drink cooler, the steady, rhythmic ticking of a large wall clock, and the relentless drumming of the rain, each drop a countdown to an unknown future. Arthur stood a silent vigil by the front window, peering into the black, rain-swept street, his aged face a stoic mask that couldn't quite hide the deep lines of worry etched around his eyes. They were in a fragile lifeboat, waiting to see if they would be rescued or swamped by the storm. A pair of headlights cut through the deluge, not the aggressive, high beams of an SUV, but the discreet, focused lights of a dark, unremarkable sedan. The car pulled up quietly in front of the store, its engine a low, confident purr. The door opened and a woman emerged, shielded by a large black umbrella. She moved with a sharp, no-nonsense purpose that defied the storm raging around her. As she stepped into the warm light of the store, the bell jingling softly behind her, Liam saw she was not what he expected. She was young, her face framed by dark hair pulled back severely, but her eyes held a weariness and a fiery intelligence that seemed far older. This was Prosecutor Sarah Ramsey. Her gaze swept the room in a single, practiced motion, taking in the soaked man, the sleeping child, the worried shopkeeper, and finally, coming to rest on the leather-bound ledger on the table. In that instant, her professional calm was pierced by a flicker of something else, something intensely personal. A hunter who had just caught the scent of her lifelong prey. Without a word of greeting, she walked to the table and placed her wet umbrella in the stand. "Mr. O'Connell?" she asked, her voice low and steady. "Arthur called me." Liam could only nod, his throat tight. He pushed the ledger across the table towards her. Her fingers, long and slender, brushed against the worn leather as she pulled it closer. She opened it, and the quiet store was filled with the soft rustle of aging paper. Liam watched her face as she scanned the first page, then the second. Her expression remained a mask of professional neutrality, but he saw her knuckles turn white as she gripped the edge of the table. She flipped through the pages, her eyes moving faster now until she stopped. Her breath caught in a tiny, almost inaudible gasp. She pointed a trembling finger at one entry. "Porsche 911 Carrera RS, George Ramsey." Her voice was a choked whisper. "That was my father." In that moment, the case ceased to be about stolen cars and organized crime. It became a daughter's reckoning, a promise made to a ghost, about to be fulfilled. Prosecutor Ramsey closed the ledger with a soft, final thud. The sound seemed to echo in the silent store. She looked at Liam, and for the first time, he saw past the federal prosecutor to the grieving daughter beneath. Her eyes were glistening, not with tears, but with a cold, righteous fury that had been simmering for 20 years. "Thank you, Mr. O'Connell," she said, her voice regaining its steel. "You've done more than you know." She pulled out a sleek, government-issue satellite phone, a world away from Liam's cracked screen. She dialed a number from memory, turning her back to them for a semblance of privacy. Her conversation was a clipped, coded series of commands. "Asset confirmed, location Alpha, execute protocol Scythe, full deployment, no local contact, I repeat, no local contact. The primary target is at location Beta, high profile, take him publicly." She snapped the phone shut and turned back to Liam and Arthur. "You and your daughter are under federal protection. Do not leave this store. My people are on their way." A vast, unseen machine had just roared to life. Miles away, the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel glittered with false light. Crystal chandeliers dripped diamonds of light onto the city's elite, their laughter echoing over the clinking of champagne glasses. On a brightly lit stage, Silas Vance, his face a carefully constructed mask of humble philanthropy, was accepting the Man of the Year award. He spoke of community, of giving back, his voice smooth and reassuring. It was in the middle of a thunderous applause that the ballroom's grand oak doors burst inward. The sound was like a thunderclap. The laughter died. The applause faltered. Panic rippled through the crowd as 24 federal agents in full tactical gear, weapons raised, swarmed into the room, their black uniforms a stark intrusion into the world of silks and tuxedos. 2 agents marched directly to the stage. Vance's smile froze, then crumbled, the mask of benevolence shattering to reveal the cold, arrogant predator beneath. "Silas Vance," one agent said, his voice amplified by the microphone. "You're under arrest." The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the room, a sound of finality that was captured by 100 flashing cameras. The story exploded. It was the lead item on every news channel, the front page of every paper. The footage of Silas Vance, the city's benevolent patriarch, being led away in handcuffs from his own gala became an iconic image of a spectacular fall from grace. The legend was not just tarnished, it was incinerated. The U.S. Attorney's Office held a press conference. with Prosecutor Ramsey at the helm. She stood before a massive photo of the 6 cars, lined up like jewels recovered from a dragon's hoard. The silver Porsche was front and center. She laid out the decades-long scheme of extortion, intimidation, and theft, her voice never wavering as she detailed the lives Vance had destroyed. The ledger, presented in a sealed evidence bag, was the smoking gun, a meticulous record of his cruelty. Liam and Arthur watched it all on a small television in the back of the store, their identities protected, silent witnesses to the earthquake they had triggered. The empire built on fear and stolen dreams was finally crumbling into dust, exposed to the light for all the world to see its rotten core. Justice was swift and absolute. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence, the ledger, the cars, the testimony of dozens of newly emboldened victims, and Liam's own detailed account of the threats made by the lawyer, Thorne, Vance's legal team crumbled. The trial was a formality. Silas Vance was convicted on charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and dozens of counts of interstate theft, sentenced to spend the rest of his miserable life in a federal penitentiary. His entire network, from the elegant Marcus Thorne to the thugs who had hunted Liam, was dismantled and imprisoned. In a quiet, private ceremony, the cars were returned to the families of their rightful owners. Prosecutor Ramsey stood beside her father's gleaming silver Porsche, her hand resting on its cool hood. She didn't cry. She simply smiled, a small, sad, and deeply triumphant smile. The ghosts of the ledger, after decades of wandering in the dark, were finally at peace. The long night of their injustice was over. The sun was finally rising. A few weeks later, a registered letter arrived for Liam. Inside was a cashier's check from the UAS Department of Justice and a letter from the consortium of insurance companies. He stared at the number printed on the check, his mind unable to process the string of zeros. It was the combined reward for the recovery of the priceless collection. The amount was staggering, a figure that belonged to a different universe. He felt a wave of dizziness, leaning against the counter of Arthur's store for support. He thought of the eviction notice, the oppressive silence of his empty apartment, the soul-crushing despair of seeing $78.14 as his life's total sum. A sound escaped his throat, a choked sob that was half laughter, half tears. He felt Maya's small hand slip into his, and he looked down at her, his vision blurred. The money wasn't just paper. It was a new beginning. It was the end of fear. It was the weight of his broken promise to his wife finally lifting from his shoulders, replaced by a lightness he hadn't felt in years. He was free. Months later, the smell of rust and decay was a distant memory, replaced by the clean scent of new tires and fresh coffee. Liam stood proudly in the open bay of his own business, Maya's Motors. It was a bright, clean, state-of-the-art auto repair shop, the kind of place he had only dreamed of. Customers trusted him, not just for his skill, but for the quiet integrity in his eyes. He was wiping grease from his hands with a clean rag, watching a customer drive away with a smile. When he looked over to the small, glass-walled office he had built in the corner, Maya was there, sitting at a small desk, diligently coloring in a drawing of a silver sports car. She was safe, she was happy, she was home. A feeling of profound, unshakable peace settled over Liam. He hadn't just fixed cars, he had fixed his life. He had walked through the fire of his own failure and emerged on the other side, not just a survivor, but a man who had built a future for his daughter with his own 2 hands, a man worthy of her love. That evening, their new house was filled with the warm, comforting smell of a simmering stew. The refrigerator behind him, which he had stocked himself that afternoon, was humming with a full payload of groceries. Liam stood in the doorway of Maya's room, watching her sleep. She was tucked into a warm bed, her favorite stuffed bear beside her, her small chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The world outside her window was a quiet suburban street, bathed in the soft, gentle glow of streetlights. There were no ghosts here, no threats lurking in the shadows. He had fulfilled his promise. He had taken care of his little girl. Liam's journey from the depths of despair to a life of peace and security shows that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden beneath the deepest ruins. His courage to face a monster, not just for himself but for the ghosts of the past, transformed his world. What stories of resilience and justice inspire you the most? If you were moved by Liam's fight for redemption, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another story of hope found in the darkness.